Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today I'm going to bring you along on a batch of Kephart style knives that I'm building. Starting out with a bar of 5/32 thick 50-100 steel, and it's 1.25 inches wide, or just a little bit over that. I've got my pattern here that I'm going to scribe out multiple blades, and I can shape that to that specific pattern. So a little bit about the Kephart blade. It's a style of knife that was popularized by early 20th century outdoorsman and writer Horace Kephart. And he was a prolific outdoorsman and I believe he wrote for Outdoors publications, but he also wrote at least one book, and that's well known among the outdoors community even today. And has a lot of good information for the woodsman, camper, or as the term goes nowadays, bushcrafter. But this was before bushcrafting was cool, you might say. So his preferred blade style was very similar to what I'm building here. And as I said a minute ago, that's what I patterned this knife after. And he talks about it in his book. I believe the book's called Book of Woodcraft. And he mentions how he had it made by some local blacksmith. And he even calls the knife ugly. And compared to the Bowie knife-influenced market of the time, of the day, it's rather plain looking, I suppose. It doesn't have the fancy clip point, etc. But it's very practical, very functional, even utilitarian, and that's why he liked it. I'm using 50-100 steel for these blades, which in my opinion is one of the best, if not the best, high carbon blade steel available to knife makers today. It's not quite as simple to use as some steels, such as 1075 or something like that, but the performance that it provides is really good, and I really like it. It's also very ubiquitous, which in my opinion is an important factor, because even if a steel is really good and or cost effective, if you can't get it, or if it's not cost effective, that doesn't help you very much. So you notice that I heated the blades up and set them on a hook to air cool, and that's done multiple times. This is a very important step to get the carbon in the steel into an appropriate condition to then quench it, which is what I'm doing here. Quenching is what hardens the steel, and then following that we have to temper it to remove some of the hardness and impart some toughness. So we're really looking for the perfect balance between hardness and toughness. And this, combined with the carbide content of our steel, gives us the edge retention in this blade that we want. Now you'll notice this is what's known as a stock removal technique. There are some people out there who believe that forging a knife is better than stock removal. However, if it was an inferior method of building a knife, I wouldn't be doing it. This steel has already been forged down immensely at the mill where it was made, and I'm now doing some relatively and comparatively very minimal shaping to make a knife. You'll see here what I'm doing is demonstrating the layer of decarburization that happens during heat treating and grinding off as much as a 1/16 of an inch to get down to the hardened and good steel. That's necessary, especially at the edge of the blade where the steel must have those qualities. I think one of the reasons some people think forging a blade is superior to stock removal in principle, or just across the board, is because of what the forging heat does to the steel. So this steel comes to me in a spheroidized or annealed condition. Spheroidizing is a form of annealing, and that means that the carbon in the steel is segregated into large carbides and not necessarily readily available to a heat treat or hardening process. The normalizing and thermocycling that I do prior to quenching the steel is crucial to unlock this carbon and pull it and break it down, pull it out of those stable carbides and put it into a condition that is readily available to an austenizing cycle, at which point it's quenched and converted to martensite. So there's some things to know about this steel in order to get a good blade, and that is one of them. And another thing that some people have a misconception about 52-100 steel is the temperature at which you austenize it. This is kind of getting off into a rabbit trail because I love metallurgy, but the point is you don't actually want to put all of that carbon that's in the steel into solution. You want to leave some out of solution, but there for the abrasion resistance that it provides. Altogether, a properly heat-treated 52-100 steel blade is just as tough as your 5160 with much better edge retention. And that's what we're doing here today. So the knife that you're seeing right here, I'm putting a hickory handle on. And since I'm working a batch of these blades, there's going to be multiple different handle materials. But this full tang construction here is the strongest way to build a knife that I know of, most durable. And when it comes to a very practical using blade like this one, it makes sense to me. And in my opinion, it's also an attractive way to build a knife. Now that we have the holes drilled for the handle bolts, we can use our countersink, and you'll notice this actually creates a shoulder down inside that hole, so it creates a very strong mechanical lock. These are called loveless bolts because they were first developed by the famous knife maker Bob Loveless. But I'm combining the two scales together to grind and polish or grind and sand the front end of the scales because I can't get to these after they're on the knife without marring up or ruining the blade. Once the front of these handle scales are finished, we can go ahead and attach them to the knife tang. You'll notice that I've drilled holes in the tang besides the bolt holes, and in this case that's simply for weight reduction. If you're using handle pins, that can also help the epoxy to secure the handle scales, but in this case the bolts are more than adequate. So now we have to shape this basically block of wood and steel down to a comfortable functional handle. And something that I concentrate on with all of my knife designs or all of my blades is a very comfortable functional handle, because you can have a great blade, you can have great steel, etc., but if the user to blade interface, if you will, is inadequate or no good, you don't really have a good knife. And in most cases, a simple design is going to be your most functional and most comfortable, and that's certainly the case with the Kephart. I'll use the belt grinder as far as I can, as long as I can, to finish this knife out, but there comes a point in time, just as with the hand sanding of the blades, or the flats of the blade, you have to put some elbow grease into it, and there's multiple surfaces on this knife still that haven't been finished out, such as the spine, the tang, and of course the handle wood. So finishing this out by hand, that's part of the process here, and it creates, in my opinion, a superior product. This particular handle scales, like I said, are hickory, but I'm using walnut stain Danish oil to bring out a little bit of the contrast, and I think it turned out pretty cool. At this point, I just need to put an edge on the blade, etch my logo on there, and we're very close to having this finished. The initial bevel is put on with a 220 grit belt, and the width behind the edge is about 12 thousandths, so pretty thin, thinner than pretty much any of your production type bushcraft blades out there, and you'll see that that makes a difference here in a few minutes. Using my whetstone and then my Arkansas stone and finally a strop to put a razor sharp edge on this knife as per usual. So as you can see, it slices paper with ease and of course shaves as well. And there is the finished package, complete with a handmade leather sheath that of course I make myself as well. There's the Kephart from Fire Creek Forge. Alright guys, don't go away, the fun is just beginning. Thanks for watching the video up to this point where I've shown you in detail how I build my version of the classic Kephart knife design. But now I'm going to start putting it through some paces, and I'm going to push the envelope a little bit on what this knife is intended to do. It's kind of a routine part of knife making for me anyway. It gives me confidence as a maker, and it also provides confidence to a potential client in the product that I'm presenting to them. It's going to help us understand how this knife is to be used comfortably in a normal situation, but also what it can do if need be. So let's get into it. So I'm going to start out with some basic whittling here. This is a dead dry stick, not a super hard wood, but it's not super soft either. But as you can see, this knife has no problem cutting, whittling this this stick. And using the spine here to scrape off some of the dead bark, but it just gives you an idea of what you can do with the spine. And we'll move on to some use of the tip here. Now this is indicative of something you might do if you're building a bow and drill fire starting set or anything along those lines. But being able to use the tip to carve or whittle out a hole in a piece of wood is, in my opinion, an important function of any bushcraft or outdoors blade. The spear point design here provides a good balance between finesse and durability. This is a pecan stick, and it's dead and dry as well. It's a hardwood, and you can see how easy this, I'm putting some pressure behind it, of course, but how efficiently this Kephart here whittles through this stick. That is not just the fact that it is sharp. Cutting clearance is also an extremely important factor in the functionality of this knife, and that's why I use the flat grind here and grind my edge to the thickness that I mentioned earlier. There's other grinds that can work as well, but you can see how well this flat grind Kephart is performing. Chopping through about a 2-inch dead dry branch here, and then using the knife to split it as if we're using it for kindling, something like that. We've got a few knots there, and this isn't too crazy. This is a little bit of batoning here. I mean, it's not absurd. The knife isn't really intended for this per se, but it will definitely handle it no problem. Horace Kephart and his contemporaries, and even generations before and after him, batoning was foreign to them. They carried a little hatchet or an axe if they needed to do chopping. But again, I'm using this knife sort of at the edges of the envelope, and you'll see that even further in a minute, just to demonstrate its ability and the quality of the steel and heat treat and so forth. So we've got about a 3 3/4, 3.5 inch branch here that we're going to chop through, and this is really kind of outside the envelope of what this knife is for, but you'll see that it can handle it no problem. The biggest problem we have here is that the blade is not quite long enough to get all the way through this particular branch and still leave me something to smack with my baton. But as far as the edge retention and the edge durability, it had no issue whatsoever. Alright, just getting to the end here, and sped that up for a little bit because it'd be laborious to watch, and it was laborious to do, so we'll make it a little less painful. So the question is, does it still shave? And it does, in fact, take hair off the arm still. So great edge retention there, and no deformation, nicks, or anything on the edge, which the camera is not in focus here, so hopefully you can see that. But the other thing to note, of course, is that this steel is easy and simple to sharpen with your strop or fine hone, so restoring that absolutely keen and razor sharp edge is not much of a chore. So there's the rest of the batch just to show you how those turned out. And hey, as always, I appreciate you guys watching, and we will see you on the next video.